they're kind of intended to fill in the background of some of the science and technology on some of these things, and some of the history as well. That would just kind of be too obscure to put in a book.
Certainly. Well, I hope that here in our remaining time, I'm going to warn the listening audience up front. We cannot begin to do justice to the body of Dr. Farrell's work, and in this entire conversation, we've only been focused on just one subset of his work, and even in this, if we had spent 10 hours, I don't think we could have covered all the real estate. Would that be fair to say?
Well, yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, it's a big story, like I say, and that's why I've written 6 books on it so far, and I'm writing a 7th. You know? So, it's a huge field, and I really don't think that even now, that given all the things that are being published in Europe about all this, particularly in Germany and Poland, I just, we're still playing catch up in this country with what's being researched in Europe.
Quite right. And if we think about the ground that we have covered thus far in the conversation, we've talked about how during the era of Nazi Germany, especially it was a period from around 1910 leading on forward, there were a tremendous number of brilliant scientists in and about Germany itself. And many of them have become common names, the Plancks, the Bohrs, etc. And yet some, I think they were just as brilliant, just as gifted, and yet their talents probably went under the radar quite largely by way of, today's favorite words for our U.S. leadership to use, national security.
Yes.
All the most important stuff is kept quiet, is not brought to the public eye. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld, in September of 2001, had talked about how $2.3 trillion were not trackable, not traceable, and a lot of that points toward the scale of investment that are made in operations that are considered classified and/or black operations.
Right.
How about if we pick up from there? Can you talk with us more about the implications, the impacts, and ramifications of someone like Martin Bormann with $800 million to play with in Argentina alone? What could that turn into?
Yeah, this is really the crucial question here, because if we make 2 assumptions in answering this question. The first assumption is there was a post-war Nazi international, a Nazi extraterritorial state, if you will, that had sufficient funding, sufficient organization, and sufficient personnel to continue its research into secret weapons, into black projects and technologies and so on. And the second assumption is that this organization could still be in existence. Now, if you make those 2 assumptions, then the picture becomes very dark, because that amount of money, obviously, in this amount of time, 60-some years since the end of World War II, would have grown considerably through careful investment.
Oh my!
And with enough money and manpower, in other words, to use the favorite expression, the sky would be the limit, quite literally. You would conceivably have, with this organization, quite literally a breakaway civilization, to use the ufologist Richard Dolan's expression and thesis. This idea that black projects in this country created effectively a breakaway civilization with its own sort of culture, with its own sort of agenda that is kind of a parasite living off of its host. Well, the idea, I think, has an earlier historical basis. In other words, I think this idea arises in Nazi Germany because, again, the history of the Nazi Party comes out of occult movements, secret societies, and so on, that midwife it into existence. So you already have a kind of a breakaway mentality. It takes over a major world power and runs that world power for 12 years, and then essentially goes back underground. So you have all the rudiments there for Richard Dolan's breakaway civilization. You have the rudiments of the technology, you have the rudiments of the finance, you have a bureaucratic structure, you have an intelligence organ attached to it. In other words, you've got all the makings for a breakaway society.
Indeed.
So, yeah, the geopolitical picture then changes dramatically, because you're not only dealing with standard post-war geopolitical conflicts between the East and the West, between the United States, Russia, China, the various European powers. You're not dealing anymore with simply geopolitics in that classical sense. You're also dealing with new entries on the field, international corporations, all the things that we are aware of. But then hidden underneath the scenes, you're dealing in almost every major power. You're dealing with effectively breakaway civilizations researching these black projects, certainly in this country, certainly in Russia. You've got this phenomenon. You're dealing with international criminal syndicates. And then finally you're dealing with the horrendous possibility that there may be an international fascist organization with their hands on some really cool toys.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, oh, my. That's not a pretty picture.
Right.
That's not a pretty picture.
Now, I can imagine that some folks at this point, once again, our old friend cognitive dissonance coming into play, I imagine some folks are wondering, now wait, if any of this were possible, how could it have been pulled off? I mean, militarily, we defeated Germany. They surrendered. It's on paper, right? Well, I think you might be able to provide an interesting twist, another way to think of that. And then also, I wonder if you can start from that point and walk us through some of that logistic about how this Nazi international could have gone underground in a logistical way.
Well, the first problem is the surrender. I actually begin the Nazi international by looking at the two German surrender instruments and a comparison of those surrenders with the Japanese surrender, all right? Because it's very, very interesting. If you read the German surrenders of May 7th and 8th, one was signed at Reims, France, and the other in Berlin the next day. In both cases, you have no representative signing in behalf of the Reich government.
Oh.
What you have are military delegations, particularly in the case of the Berlin surrender. You have Field Marshal Keitel, Luftwaffe General Stumpf, I believe it was, and then Admiral von Friedeburg for the German Navy. At the Reims surrender, it was Colonel General Jodl. So, in other words, at the surrenders, you have the representatives of the three German service branches surrendering. You have no one signing these surrenders on behalf of the Reich government. You have no one sitting down saying, the Third Reich, the government of the Third Reich hereby surrenders to the Allies, or some equivalent statement. Now, this is significant because in the Japanese surrender, you do have it made very clear that the surrender is being signed on behalf of the Emperor, the Imperial Diet, the Imperial General Staff. Basically everybody that needs to be surrendering is surrendering. Okay? In the case of the Third Reich, however, no, it's just the German military. There's no representative, in other words, of the Reich government. And what is really significant to me, Antonin, is that the Allies had representatives of the Nazi Party in their hands. They could have easily demanded that those representatives sit down, sign a surrender instrument, abolishing the Nazi Party and declaring it to be a criminal organization or some such thing. None of this takes place. None of this takes place. So from the standpoint of law, this surrender appears to me to be rather dodgy. And the interesting thing is there are codicils in the Berlin surrender that indicate that, well, we'll tack other codicils onto this as we think of them to be signed at a later date. Well, the problem is, who are you going to get to sign on behalf of the Third Reich?
Yes, yeah.
Exactly. So, this from the standpoint of international law is a huge, huge problem. It sounds kind of picky, but in the context of an emerging post-war deal, especially nasty, dirty little deals being negotiated between members of American intelligence and members of Nazi intelligence, this omission takes on a rather different and more sinister significance. And it raises your other question very directly. How does this Nazi organization work logistically? Well, it has to work logistically at some level, in collusion with one or the other of the post-war powers. In other words, it has to be existing with the connivance of either the Soviet Union or the United States or both. And that, you see, that's the real rub. The other way that it works logistically is, you know, you can compartmentalize research and manage or farm out your requirements for parts. You know, order this part from this firm and this other part from that firm, and no one really knows what all of this is for. And all you really need to do is assemble it. That's the way it works in American black projects, and I strongly suspect that this is the way that they made it work after the end of the war, particularly with what they were doing in Argentina. There's definite evidence that they're using German firms that supplied parts during the war, after the war, and supplying the same sorts of equipment. And what the German firms can't supply, you know, they can get American firms to do. So in other words, this is a very tightly organized, well-oiled machine.
Indeed. And I think there's another interesting twist, I believe, with Argentina and nearing the conclusion of the war. I'm not sure my mind is already going to the twist I'm thinking of, but maybe talk to us a bit about that.
Well, you know, the really interesting thing, you know, I've studied World War II since I was a kid, and even as a kid, I wondered, you know, why in the name of sense does Juan Perón declare war on Nazi Germany in March of 1945, 2 months before the end of the war? And the reason that always puzzled the daylights out of me is that Juan Perón loved the Nazis. He just thought they were wonderful. In fact, there's a picture of Colonel Juan Perón traveling in Adolf Hitler's entourage after the fall of France in Paris in 1940.
Interesting.
Okay, in other words, Perón was very, very tightly connected, not only to Mussolini's Italy, but to Hitler's Germany. And had been and visited and traveled and gone on joint military exercises with them. So in other words, Perón is the quintessential Nazi file. So when he becomes president of Argentina, you know, it always puzzled me, what in the name of sense is he doing declaring war on Nazi Germany? And then you add to this fact, the standard historical response is, well, Perón was pressured to do so by the United States, all right? And there they leave the matter. So in other words, if you're an American history student, you will never, ever be told the story, nor will it ever occur to you to investigate further. Well, if you read Perón's memoirs, what he himself says is something to the effect, well, we hadn't lost control of Germany simply by our declaration of war. On the contrary, it worked to Germany's benefit. Why? Because under international law, as a belligerent, it gave Argentina the right to enter Germany with its planes and ships. And then Perón goes on to say, and that's how a great many were able to come to Argentina. Aha. So in other words, Argentina, as an ally of the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, went right in there, picked up a bunch of Nazis, and flew them back to Buenos Aires and served them cocktails and peanuts on the way.
Indeed.
Now, you know, talk about a slick trick.
Yes, indeed.
And I strongly suspect, Antonin, that isn't really even the end of the story, because I strongly suspect that certain elements in the United States wanted that to happen. In other words, that this may have been the hidden reason that this country pressured him to do that. And he was all too ready to do so because it suited his purposes as well, and it suited the Nazis' purposes because it gave them a nice base of operations in a technologically advanced country that had enough of an industrial base to accomplish what they wanted